Go back. Yeah, perfect. I've opened all of them.
And now the light. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Just a couple of things before we start. So first of all, if you have any questions, come see me during the break. I will have to run right after class because I have a flight to catch, so I won't be able to stay here for questions right after the class. But so feel free to come during the break. I'll stay in the room, and otherwise, you can write me an email if there's any question regarding the second part of the class, or we can, we'll see each other next week. And then another kind of more logistical point that I wanted to make is that I am trying to organize something for the Semaine de Lecture, so for the reading week. I know that some of you might have made plans to travel or to do other things, so it's nothing compulsory, absolutely. It won't be tested in the exam. It's just something that I want to organize in case any of you is around and want to take part. I'm trying to, the idea is to have ideally a visit to the WTO and to UNCTAD, the investment division. You should pick one of the two. There are limits in terms of how many people I can bring for each visit. If there's a lot of people that are interested and there's too many people for the visits, then I'll see whether to invite the people here. I will figure something out. But as soon as they will let me know, it's going to be during that week, not necessarily at this time, but during that week, because I know that all classes are not happening. Once I have a few options of dates and times, we will send an email on Moodle, or something through Moodle, and we will give you just not many days to kind of sign up, or maybe like a week or so to show your interest. And once I have the numbers, then I can actually see what is doable, how many visits, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just keep in mind that this is going to happen on Moodle hopefully soon. And then again, if you're here and interested, sign up quickly so that then I get a better sense of the people. But it could be quite fun. And the idea would be to have in both organizations both like a presentation or a discussion with people that work there, and then in particular for the WTO, I'm thinking more, but even for the Palais, because UNCTAD is in the Palais. A tour, a little tour of the building, so that could be nice. Again, you don't have to feel that you have to do it. I know that many of you that are maybe exchange or traveling have made plans for that week. It's nice, but just so you know. Last week I was very ambitious. I couldn't finish everything that I planned to talk to you about. We talked about non-discrimination, right? MFN, national treatment. We covered quite a lot of ground. Remember, we finished with this slide, right? So MFN, kind of always applies, of course, when it comes to national treatment. So Article 3, those are internal measures, right? So they're not border measures, they're internal measures. And in particular, fiscal measures 3.2, so internal taxes or internal charges, and internal regulations, right? And again, you have a violation of these provisions only if the measure is discriminatory. So you can impose internal taxes, you can impose internal regulations, of course, but you cannot discriminate, right, against foreign products. Now we're going to move to this side of our table, and we're going to first finish this part. I will tell you about border measures, which are those measures and those barriers which can be both fiscal or non-fiscal, or tariff or non-tariff. You can use both terms. But what makes, what they have in common is that they are border measures. So they are applied because of importation or exportation. And they, in particular, when it comes to import, tariff and non-tariff barriers, they really restrict market access. So we're going to talk about two types of measures, one fiscal and one non-fiscal, and they both are measures that can restrict market access. Now, I want to start with tariff barriers, and in particular, customs duties. Now, you have heard a lot about customs duties in the last months. There has been a little bit of a hectic, imposition from some countries of very high customs duties or tariffs. We don't have a definition in the GATT or in any WTO agreement of what a customs duty is. And actually, the term is used as a synonym with tariffs. So you might sometimes find, the term import tariff or the term import customs duty. That's the same thing. Generally, we see customs duties or tariffs when it comes to goods, to trading goods. It's quite rare. It's not impossible. You could have a customs duty on services, but it's quite rare. Probably the best example with this, which is quite interesting at the moment, was a border tax called BIT tax, B-I-T, BIT tax. And the idea was that this would apply to electronic communications containing digital content, output, or services. Streaming of movies or TV shows on platforms like Netflix or Disney Plus or ebooks. So there is there was a proposal and the idea in many countries to impose a tax on this kind of services. And the reason is that all these things are now electronic, but they used to be physical products. I mean, I think we are from different generations maybe, but when I was your age, I would go to Blockbuster and I would get my DVD and I would watch it. Same with books, right? And those products, physical products, were taxed. Now we have these digital versions that are not taxed. Because in 1998, WTO members have decided on a moratorium, or not maintaining, not imposing taxes on these electronic communications. And every time at the ministerial conference, there is a whole discussion, should we extend or not what we call the e-commerce moratorium. It's very controversial. It's going to happen again, another discussion at the ministerial in February. As you can imagine, you have companies, right, mostly in developed countries, that want the moratorium to continue. They don't want to pay this custom duty. But you can imagine that for some countries, in particular developing ones, that could be a nice revenue, right? So there is a lot of tension. Last ministerial in 2024, countries agreed on extending the e-commerce moratorium. In February or March, when the next ministerial is, we'll see whether they will agree or not. But right now is one of the hottest topics at the WTO, what to do, because there's a lot of interests behind it. But now with this exception, I would say that you will mostly see customs duties or tariffs on goods. So that's what we're going to focus on. As I was saying, we don't have a definition, but in general, you can consider as a customs duty or a tariff a fiscal charge or tax on imported products that is due because of the importation. And the GATT only targets import tariffs or import customs duties. There are no rules in the GATT about export duties. Only import in the GATT. Parenthesis, some countries, when they acceded, China is a good example, in the protocol of accession, they have obligations on export tariffs. So for some countries, you need to go into their protocol of accession, they might have some obligations, some duties, but for the general membership under the GATT, it only tackles import tariffs. So what is important is not so much where and when the tax or the tariff is levied, at the border, but the reason, the event that triggers, we said this already last week. That's the important element that helps you distinguish customs duty from internal taxes, which is important because if it's a customs duty, a certain provision applies that we'll see. If it's an internal tax, you have Article 3.2, non-discrimination, right? Very different treatment. So some internal taxes are levied at the border, some customs duties once the product is in the territory. So it's not so much where you have to pay, but it's why. Do you have to pay this tax to be able to access the market? It's a customs duty. Or you can just enter the market, but then if you want to sell, for example, in certain supermarkets, there is a sales tax that applies to whoever wants to sell their product. That's an internal tax. It's not the access to the market is not conditional on paying the tax. So it's really what event motivates rather than when do you have to pay it or where physically. Now, tariffs or customs duties, they can be imposed. We will see there is a difference with quantitative restrictions that we'll see in a few minutes, but countries they don't have to eliminate tariffs. It's okay to have them, but what you need to do is to progressively reduce your tariffs. And in particular, as we will see, you can't impose tariffs that are higher than the maximum that you have agreed to impose. But there is not a prohibition, a general prohibition to introduce tariffs. We saw, I showed you this, I think, one of our first classes. Since the GATT, there have been rounds of tariff negotiations. Well, maybe before we get to the tariff negotiations, a few more points on tariffs in general. There are different kinds. Most of them are ad valorem. Ad valorem, which means that they are, let me just, because we love Latin. Which means that they are based on the value of the product. It's usually a percentage of the value. There is a customs duty of 15% on computers. Computer is 1,000. The value is 1,000 francs. 150 francs is your tax. I mean, this is obviously a lot, but to give you a sense. So usually, not all, but the majority are ad valorem. So it's important to understand the value of the product to then determine the tariff. Most tariffs are MFN tariffs in the sense that once you choose and you impose a tariff, 15% on computers, you apply the same rate to all other member states. That's the majority. Some tariffs are what we call preferential tariffs or customs duties. US, Mexico, and Canada have a very nice free trade agreement called USMCA. They have preferential tariffs with each other. So for countries that have free trade agreements, we will get to them at the end of the session, free trade agreements, the tariff rates they impose vis-a-vis each other's products, they are preferential. They are usually more favorable. All the other tariffs, they follow MFN. So in theory, they should be the same for all the other member states. And then, of course, you have tariffs that you impose for products coming from non-WTO members, and then you can do whatever you want. There's no MFN if a country is not WTO and if it's not part of your preferential or free trade agreement. Now, we had all these rounds of negotiations, and they have been very successful. This was really one of the main success of the GATT years, right? Countries got together and they managed to really, really reduce tariffs. Just to give you an idea, the average tariff on industrial products in the 40s in developed countries was about 40%. Super high. I mean, that was the heritage of the, of the 20s and the 30s. And by the time they got here to the 60s, it was down to 8.3%. Developed countries. Huh? So it was very successful. But there's something I think that is quite important that will help you understand, for example, some of the complaints that the current US government has had regarding tariffs. Tariff negotiations follow the principle of reciprocity, generally, meaning that, you know, when you're negotiating tariff reductions with another country, you need to be ready to, you know, if you expect certain reductions, you need to be ready to reciprocate and to, you know, also reduce in other products or in other sectors. This does not apply to, you know, negotiations between developed and developing countries. Then we have something called relative reciprocity, meaning that when there is a developed and a developing country that are negotiating tariff reductions, you can't expect from the developing country the same level of commitment in terms of reducing emissions. They will reciprocate, but depending on what they can do from a, you know, development, economic point of view, social point of view, right? So you don't expect the same level of commitment. In fact, for the first 4 rounds, I think it was until Dillon, developing countries did not commit to reduce tariffs. It was only developed countries. Developing countries started here in the 60s to commit to reduce tariffs, but much, much less. This was one of the many issues that the current president of the United States had with the system. That developed countries had over time reduced their tariffs a lot, but because of this idea of relative reciprocity, developing countries that had a certain economic situation in the 60s, which is not the same today, have not reduced their tariffs at the same level. The result of tariff negotiations is what we call a tariff binding. A tariff binding, which is basically a maximum amount, is going to be the maximum of your tariff for a certain product. Tariff binding, we call it. And all these tariff bindings, they are contained in schedules. We call them schedules of concessions that are annexed to the GATT and that form an integral part of the WTO, you know, system, WTO agreement. Each country has its own schedule, hundreds of pages, because all products are divided into thousands of categories. And then for each subcategory, there is the specific maximum tariff rate that the country accepts to impose, which is the bound tariff, which is the maximum tariff. You cannot go higher than that. You commit to not increase your tariff higher than your bound, your maximum. Each country has its own schedule, with the exception, for example, of the EU. In the case of the EU, you only have the EU schedule. You don't have each country's, because the tariffs are common for all EU member states. This is what they look like. This is just one out of hundreds of pages. So you see, you have all, for example, here, 18, or this one, 1806, it's chocolate and other food containing cocoa, and then you have a lot of other subcategories. So it's extremely detailed, extremely detailed. And what is important for you is this, bound rate. This is the maximum, the maximum tariff that you can impose. So you see why it's important to distinguish internal tax from a customs duty, because the internal tax you can have as high as you want, as long as you don't discriminate. I can introduce a sales tax on chocolate, like super high, as long as I treat Swiss chocolate as I treat Italian chocolate. Here I can't. I can't go higher than this. And you have it, Article 2, which is about the schedules of concessions, tells you that. This is one of those articles that I don't think it's super beautifully written, but the message is that you cannot impose a tariff that goes above your bound tariff rate. So that sets your ceiling. So that's the first kind of duty that you have, is that once you have all your bound tariffs, you cannot go higher. Question, can you go lower? What do you think? Your bound tariff is, let's say here, for instance, on this is 8%. Can I decide to do 3? So I can't do 10, but can I do 3? Is it allowed? I see very confused faces. It's either yes or no. You have a 50% chance of getting it right. Come on. I mean, the duty is not to go above. Yes. Yes. Yes, you can. Countries are reluctant to reduce their bound tariffs because they like having the flexibility to move around. But you can't totally impose something lower. That's the difference between the bound rate and the applied rate. These are examples. I don't remember which product this is, actually. Probably something related to chocolate again. But, so you see, there can be a big difference. I mean, look at here. 69, but then actually you apply 12. Yes?
Is it possible to have the bound rate the same all the time, but then first lower the applied rate and then go up again? Or is that against the principle that it needs to be?
Excellent. This is an excellent point. It's exactly where I was going. So you can move. The difference between your applied rate and your bound, it's called water, like when you swim. On the one hand, having a lot of water is great because it means that you actually have very low tariffs. But it's also very risky because it means that you can move a lot and within your bound, you can do whatever you want, which makes it tricky, for example, for businesses. Because, here, I mean, you're investing in Burundi, you're selling your products to Burundi. It might one day go to 30. It could go to 50. It could go to, you just don't know. There is still one duty that you have, though. Yes, you can move, but you need to do it MFN. So if I decide to go from 9 to 6, so I lower it, or I increase it, I have to do it for everybody. So the first obligation you have is not to go above your bound rate. And when it comes to your applied rate, you can move, but you need to follow MFN. So you need to treat all your trading partners equally. So if you decide to go, for example, here, China, so China doesn't have a lot of water in this case, but they decide to go down to 7, they have to go down to 7 for, let's say, chocolate from Switzerland, from France, from Italy, from, Canada. So those are the two key, yes?
Why is the MFN applied rate for the European Union higher than the bound rate?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. There may be a mistake. I'm gonna go check on that because it should not be. You spotted it right. I'm gonna check on that because it should not be the case. I will look into that. All right, that's kind of the main things that I want to tell you about customs duties. Voila. So you see why it's important, again, to distinguish between an internal tax or a customs duty, because it's very different. With an internal tax, you can go as high as you want as long as you don't discriminate. With a customs duty, you can't go above your bound rate, ideally. Unless that it's a sign of a violation of Article 2, it could also be, but I will look into the table. And now let's move here. Let's move to a border measures, so border barriers that affect market access, but non-fiscal, so non-tariff. There are many types. Some we will look at next week. Technical regulations and standards, for example, that limit market access. For example, in order to import fridges, they have to be of a certain size. I don't know. Or vehicles, they have to consume below a certain amount. Those are technical regulations and standards. We will look at those, and they're not tariffs. We will look at those specifically next week because they have their whole agreement. They deserve a whole part of a session. But I want to focus now on quantitative restrictions, which is one of the most used and most dangerous type of a non-tariff barrier. Quantitative restrictions, as the name suggests, are measures imposed at the border that limit the quantity of a product that can be imported or exported. So here is a difference with tariff barriers. They don't just apply to imports, they apply to imports and exports. And the other main difference is that they are prohibited. Article 11 is your go-to provision here. General elimination of quantitative restrictions. No prohibition or restrictions other than duties, taxes, because it's not a tariff barrier, whether made effective through quotas, import or export licenses, or other measures, shall be instituted or maintained on the importation or exportation. So quantitative restrictions on imports and exports are prohibited. The main ones are bans, which are prohibitions, like an import ban, for example. We'll see a few cases today. I want no product containing, no, that's actually an internal measure in that case. But let's say I don't want to import tuna that is fished in a way that harms dolphin. Ban on imports of tuna that is fished in a certain way. Or a quota. A quota is when you limit the quantity. I can import only 500 electric vehicles per year. Or 1,000 tons of cocoa powder. So it's not a ban. You can import some, but you limit the quantity. The effect is kind of similar to imposing a tariff in the sense that you end up reducing the quantity of the product that you import. So you probably will raise the price, but they're considered so much more dangerous because they're less transparent. It's very difficult. For example, if you have a tariff at the border, it's quite easy to then assess what will be the final price for the consumers, how much will those imports suffer, and then how much will they have to raise the cost. With quotas, it's very hard to make these calculations. They're also harder to negotiate. And in general, the administration of quotas is way less transparent. That is why they are prohibited. So there is a preference in the WTO for tariff barriers than quantitative restrictions, at least this type of non-tariff barriers. They're considered quite dangerous and very trade restrictive, and so they're prohibited. So they have to be restrictions, okay? So a limitation of the quantity of the product. And again, many cases are about imports, but there are several instances where you can imagine a country wanting to limit the quantity of export, in particular when it's raw materials. There were a few cases a few years ago against China because China had introduced, export duties that they can't because of the protocol of accession, and export quotas for raw materials and rare earths. These very rare minerals, China has about 90% of these minerals in the world. These minerals are very important for a lot of industries, high-tech technology, renewable energy technologies, and so on and so forth. So the idea is if I limit the export, it means that most of these minerals stay in my country, which means that my industries that need those minerals are going to have them at a lower cost. I export very little, they will be very expensive in the rest of the world, so foreign companies that need them will have to pay a lot. And then what's interesting, that it's a little bit different from what we have seen, is that it talks about measures, which is a very kind of vague term. It doesn't talk about laws, it doesn't talk about regulations, it talks about measures. This has been understood as to mean something broader than laws and regulations. Even some voluntary measures, for example, they're not binding, they are not enshrined in a law, could potentially fall under this provision. It's a prohibition, but there are exceptions. There are some exemptions that you find here. One that is often used is usually the first one, letter A. So when, for example, you introduce export prohibitions or restrictions only on a temporary basis to prevent or relieve critical shortages of foodstuffs. So here it's the idea that there is an emergency situation in your country, there is shortages of certain foodstuffs, so you need to keep them inside your territory because you need them to feed your population, basically. So it's a case where you can, you don't need to respect this first, but it's quite rare. It's quite rare that you actually, a case that is brought as a dispute would fit into this category. Usually, countries that adopt these measures, very often sometimes they adopt them for protectionist measures, for protectionist reasons, but sometimes they adopt them for, very legitimate public policy objectives. You might want to, for example, restrict or ban the import of cigarettes to protect public health. You might want to, the example that I gave you earlier, limit or ban the imports of tuna or shrimp that has been fished, killing turtles or dolphins to protect these endangered species. So the idea is to protect the environment. You might want to restrict the import of online gambling services to protect public morals. So very often, quantitative restrictions are introduced to pursue other societal values or public policy objectives. Yes?
What happens if one kind of those decisions are imposed or are the measures imposed by a legal decision by an internal court of the state?
Oh, that's a very good point. So you mean, no, yes, so it would fall into the next, so there are exceptions to this. So if you're following, for example, a legal decision, or if you're following a law or a regulation, for instance, in certain situations it could, you can try to justify your measures. In particular, under what we will see an article on general exceptions. But again, you might not always necessarily win, in the sense that even if there is a legal decision that would, or even a domestic law that says something that you would not necessarily be able to justify, you would still need to comply with all the requirements that I will show you in a second. But that could be a ground for justification. So before we get to the exceptions, we have completed our little box. So there's a measure. The first question you need to ask yourself is, okay, is it a border measure or is it an internal measure? So why is the measure imposed? Is it because of import, for example, or export, or is it just an internal measure? And then you'll see, is it fiscal or not? And if that is the case, violation is only if you discriminate. You can impose all the laws you want. You have regulatory sovereignty as a state. You can impose all the internal taxes you want, but you cannot discriminate. So only if you're discriminatory, you will violate. Otherwise, you won't. Now, here, you don't need discrimination. If you impose a customs duty higher than your bound tariff, it's irrelevant. And it's not about discrimination. You're violating your obligation. If you impose a quantitative restriction, you're violating. It's not about discrimination. Just the measure itself violates the rule. There are, and since the beginning of the GATT, and even more so in the WTO, there are a lot of exceptions to these rules. So these are the key rules, market access rules, non-discrimination. But again, sometimes countries might have to maybe restrict trade and might end up violating some of these rules for a lot of different reasons. And there are a lot of exceptions that allow countries to do so. Oh, wait. And now we get to what was supposed to be today's class. So these are all, we are not going to look at all of them, don't worry. But these, in theory, are all the exceptions that exist. And this goes back to what I mentioned, I think, in one of the first classes, that in particular, at the beginning, the idea was to, yes, we liberalize, we multilateralize, but we also have to insert some flexibilities to allow countries to pursue, for example, legitimate policy goals, or for any other reasons. So you have these general exceptions. This is what we will in particular look at, or we'll try to look at today. So you have the general exceptions. They are the most used, which allow countries, allow WTO members to violate any rule of the GATT when they're trying to pursue, and this goes to what you were saying, to pursue some domestic policy objectives, whether it's protecting global health, public health, the environment, public morals, or other things. Exceptions for national and international security. For about 70 years, nobody cared. Now, very exciting. Everybody wants to do things and try to justify saying it's national security. That's why I'm imposing crazy tariffs. Exceptions for regional trade agreements. In particular, this is an exception to MFN. You, in theory, under MFN, have to treat all your trading partners in the same way, but actually, this exception allows you, for example, to create a customs union or a free trade area with other countries and give them a more favorable treatment. It's allowed. And then we have exceptions for economic development. So you can treat developing countries more favorably than you treat developed countries. So as you can see, yes, we have rigid rules, but then there are a lot of exceptions to these rules. And I want to start by telling you a little bit about these general exceptions. We find them both in the GATT and in the GATS on services. The wording is very similar, but I'm going to focus on the GATT, the main case law, the most kind of exciting and progressive case law. We find it here in the GATT. Here it is. Now, you don't have to learn all of it, don't worry. I will point you to the specific parts that I want you to remember. But this is your Article 20, general exceptions, which allows you, as a WTO member, to violate any rule of the GATT for, if you comply with what's in here. So there has to be a violation. You invoke this when there has been a violation. I mentioned last week a very famous case called EC Asbestos. It was in 3.4, so it was an internal regulation. France had introduced an internal regulation, a ban on the sale of asbestos fibers and products containing asbestos, but it was allowing CPG fibers. And Canada was arguing that they were like products, and so because Canada was exporting asbestos fibers and asbestos products to France, they were arguing that they were being discriminated against. And at the panel level, the appellate body found that there was no violation. But the panel level did find a violation of Article 3.4, no discrimination. And so that's when the EU had to rely on Article 20 to justify. Now, of course, if you're building your first submission, what you do is you try to cover all your bases. So first, your first argument is there is no violation of Article 3.4, and even if there is a violation, it is justified by Article 20. And in particular, in that case, it was B. It was for the letter B, necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. It was a public health measure that France had adopted because of the toxic and carcinogenic nature of asbestos fibers. So there has to be first a violation, but that violation is justified, can be justified by fitting into one of these possibilities. Now, this is a limited exception and a conditional exception. It's limited because this list is a closed list. It's exhaustive. That's it. You can play with interpretation, but that's it. You can come up with something that isn't in that list. So it's limited. And it's conditional because you need to comply with all the conditions in the paragraphs. And here, in this one, this is the hardest, the preamble. We call it the chapeau. For the non-French speaking. Which literally means hat, but it's how we call the preambular paragraph. You need to comply with all the conditions, and we will go through some of these conditions together. So it's a limited and a conditional exception. Now, there are a couple, before we get to some of these paragraphs, I want to make two kind of more general points. The first one is that there are a lot of discussions as to the scope of Article 20. The first one is, can I use it to justify a measure that violates an agreement which is not the GATT? Or can I only use it to justify a violation of the GATT? This is a question that has been raised in many, many cases. In particular, a lot of cases brought against China because of alleged violations of the accession protocol. The accession protocol does not have exceptions. So there have been a few cases where China has said, okay, I violated this or that provision of my accession protocol, but I did it for one of these reasons. I want to use GATT Article 20 to justify my measure. Another situation where this is an important question is when you're talking about subsidies. We will address subsidies next week. There is a specific agreement on subsidies which does not contain exceptions. So if your subsidy falls into the definition and the categories of that agreement, you cannot justify it. So can you use this to justify your measure? This is a big question, and in general, the quick answer is no. Unless, so in general, you can use Article 20 to justify violations of the GATT, unless you're trying to justify the violation of a provision in another agreement that makes explicit or implicit reference to the GATT. So there are some agreements where provisions make explicit reference, and other times they make reference to WTO agreements consistently with WTO agreements. So when there is this language, sometimes the panel and appellate body have said, okay, it kind of incorporates the whole body so we can apply. But if there is no reference to anything, then no, you cannot use Article 20. Yes?
Does the reference need to be in the article that's specifically
Yes.
about the violation?
Yes.
Any article?
Usually in that article, unless you have an article at the beginning of the treaty that applies to all the articles, but it's quite, you will see me and hear me next week when I talk about subsidies is my main area of work when it comes to trade, and I have been arguing and advocating for big reforms of the existing treaty, which is, and I have no trouble saying it in front of, that is recorded, is just very outdated, very obsolete. It makes zero sense today. We were having a presentation earlier. The same rules apply to subsidies to fossil fuel industry and to renewable energy. There's no way to distinguish them. There's no way. And subsidies are so much less trade restrictive than a ban. I mean, a ban is like an embargo. Yet you have an exception to justify a ban, and you don't have an exception to justify a subsidy. So I will get very upset next week. So I'm trying not to get upset today. It's been already a very long day, but we will get to that. And it's a huge question. The other, but for now, remember, just keep in mind that as a general rule, you can use Article 20 only for violations of the GATT unless there is a wording and language in the provision in another agreement or protocol that you allegedly have violated that can be interpreted as a reference to the GATT. The second question, very difficult one, that we don't actually have an answer yet because the appellate body has always found ways to avoid it. Can we use Article 20 to justify a measure that violates the GATT but is protecting a value outside of the territory of the state that is adopting the measure? So is there a jurisdictional limitation or not? I'm going to give you an example to make it more concrete. Using a case that we will look at today that I already mentioned, which is the US shrimp case. This was a case, just to give you a little bit of the facts, that was brought by these 4 countries against the United States because the United States had introduced, well, first of all, the United States, for quite some time they had been studying the mortality of sea turtles. Lots of interest for sea turtles. Sea turtles are protected by this convention, CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's an environmental convention from 1973 that protects endangered species in general. All 7 species of sea turtles are contained in Appendix 1 of this convention, super endangered, super at risk of extinction. The United States realizes that one of the main reasons of mortality of sea turtles is because of the commercial catching or fishing of shrimp. So they developed this, TED, Turtle Excluder Device. It's a mechanism that, and this was imposed in the United States, everyone who wants to fish and sell shrimp has to use this. It's super easy. All the shrimp gets to at the end of the net, and there is this little escape door that allows bigger objects, including sea turtles, to swim out. And the idea is this is a sea turtle friendly way of catching shrimp. So they impose a law in the United States that in order to catch shrimp and sell it, you need to use this device. And they impose a ban, import ban. If you don't use this, or you don't prove to me that where you're catching your shrimps, there's no risk of harming sea turtles, you can't export shrimp or shrimp products in the US. But why is it extraterritorial? Because those countries, India, Malaysia, the US is basically saying you are killing sea turtles in your sea. That's not the territorial sea of the US. So one of the questions that was posed is, can the US impose a ban to protect sea turtles that are outside of its jurisdiction? Now, the appellate body was very, this is one of my favorite decisions. And I'm not saying that I agree with this specific part, but they very cleverly avoided. They said, it's not so much about, it's not so much about the jurisdictional limitation, but in this case, so they moved in this case, not every single sea turtle, but sea turtles migrate. So some, at some point, will swim through the territorial waters of the US. So there is a sufficient nexus. So it's okay. So they did not tell, and this is very problematic because we have been, with some colleagues, we've been discussing a lot to what extent we could use this for climate measures.
That's what I was actually to ask.
So this is our best chance, is what we've been trying to do is to say, well, the measure is basically dealing with emissions that happen far away, but you are contributing to global and there is a sufficient nexus between me, far away from you, and the global rising temperature. That's the best argument you can have at the moment, based on shrimp, where they didn't, again, the appellate body didn't tell us yes, no, jurisdictional limitation, but it says in this case there is a sufficient nexus. So if you find a sufficient nexus, you should be fine. All right. One last thing before we take a break. There is a specific way to interpret this article, a specific order that was clarified by the appellate body in a case that you have in the syllabus called US gasoline. This is one of the best examples. US gasoline is one of the best examples of a case where the panel got almost everything wrong. Most of what the appellate body has said has been reversing what the panel has said. Almost everything. There is poor thing. I mean, but it also showed you how important the appellate body was, that we don't have it anymore. So in US gasoline, it tells us that in order that the justifying protection of Article 20, the measure must come under one of the particular exceptions, and it must also satisfy the requirements imposed by the opening clause, the chapeau. The analysis is two-tiered. First, provisional justification, because it falls, in this case it was 20G, but because it falls under one of the paragraphs, and then compliance with the chapeau. The panel had done the other way around. The panel went kind of like this. They start by the chapeau, and then they move to the paragraphs. It's wrong. First, you look at the paragraphs, and you need to make sure that it falls under at least one. It can be more, but you need to get at least one. If it falls under at least one of these paragraphs, then the measure is provisionally justified, and you need to make sure that it complies with the chapeau. So these two steps. The paragraphs are really about the objective of the measure. What is the measure about? What does the measure do? The chapeau is about the implementation. Chapeau, very important. If you look at the statistics, I haven't looked in a couple of years, but until a few years ago, only in 2 disputes, there was a successful justification under Article 20. Now, usually, the paragraphs are easier. Usually, the measure passes the test under the paragraphs because they're often measures that pursue a legitimate policy objective, public health, public morals, but more often than not, they are implemented in a way that is disguised protectionism, that is arbitrary discrimination. So the problem is in the implementation of the measure, not on the measure itself. And there is a lot of criticism saying, oh, but Article 20 really, yes, it's there, but it never works. It's not entirely true because, first of all, if your measure is fine and it's just how you implemented it that is not fine, all you need to do is to change the implementation. And I will show you an example. You don't have to withdraw the measure. You can keep it, but just implement it differently, which is much easier than withdrawing and changing, the whole thing. And there are a lot of cases, a lot of situations where you have a measure that violates the GATT, but that is so obviously justified that a dispute is not brought. Bringing a dispute is expensive. You bring a dispute when you know you have a good case. So there are actually lots of measures that violate the GATT, but that are so clearly justified that they're not even challenged. So just to kind of put in perspective, and just because only twice a country was successful, it doesn't mean that it's not a good provision. It's actually very important because and we will see, we'll do a couple of exercises and you will see that it really helps you filter and understand whether a measure is really good and should really be allowed or whether, it could be done a little bit differently. Let's take, I would propose a slightly shorter break, 10 minutes. So we come back around 3:21. And we're gonna continue. Sure.
Okay. But there's not like they.
No,
Okay.
and usually get
That makes more
But overall, I've enjoyed it.
Second right, sorry.
Measures that are disguised protection measures that will not pass the board, they will be okay. So it's considered to be more dangerous to a lot of PMs because actually a lot of can be allowed, while in this case you can still allow them, but there is these checks and balances of Article 5. But environmentalists highly criticize this because they say, I mean, and I have had a phase that I was also part of those people that would think, no, we need to have
This criteria.
I do now. The reason to clear answer, I now believe that it's better to go for Article 20.
Why?
Because it provides these checks and balances. Because I can think of, I mean, I will show you. We will do the whole shrimp story, and you will see that shrimp passed the paragraph, you did not pass the test.
Because it was actually greenwashing, right? Like
It was done in a way that they did, but they would have done it better. So this allows you to then improve your measure, because then the US improved the measure and then they were okay. So I think it's a little bit more of a screening that we really only allow those measures that are truly, genuinely, well designed to protect.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
So, but
And what would the counter argument be by the environmentalists to make kind of the standard?
well, an argument that I have made in the past, for example, was that, which I still think that is still important, is that it has to do with the burden of proof. So here, you, the applicant that adopt the gut violating environmental measure, it's all on you, the burden of proof. It's on you, the burden of persuading the judges. If instead you add the PPMs, it's the country that is claiming that you violate that burden. So procedurally, and some will tell you, and again, I love those, and I still believe in that it's more of a message, that you're sending the message that it's not just a small exception, that it's sexualism to their matters, and that we care about the WTO is more than trade, it's more about that. But concretely, I think if well used, this is a very good provision. But if it's well used,
Could it be just another alternative would be to reverse the burden of proof for some topics?
an alternative could be what you have in Article 11, that are those are carve-outs, which means that there isn't a violation exception, but it's basically, it's not even a violation. So you exclude certain measures from having violations. So if you phrase this as a carve-out, meaning the above provision is not violated if the measure, the burden of proof stays on the complainant. Because you need to prove that that doesn't apply. So that's an argument. And not so much in trade, but in investment, and we will see it with investment. Investment agreements, they are used a lot because it's a little bit more effective than exception.
Have we seen it by bus? Because I'm not remembering.
No, we saw. I mean, I went through it quickly, but this one. Wait, no, it's here.
It's okay.
Don't worry, it's fine. It was here. The provisions of paragraph 1 shall not extend to the following. So here, if I am claiming that you are violating, I need to prove that you are not covered by one of these. So this is a carve-out. You don't have a violation of paragraph 1. For Article 20, you have a violation, which is justified, and you need to prove that it's justified. It's just very simple language.
Basically, the exception for the prohibition of no quotas is the carve-out.
This one is.
This one.
Only this one. This one that you see here. So if you wanna, for example, if you have a quantitative restriction because of the critical shortage, then if you are challenging my measure, you need to prove that that doesn't apply.
But it's B only or all ABC?
ABC.
Okay.
Because you see, the provisions of paragraph 1 shall not extend to all of this. But if you don't, if your reason is not here, if your reason is in Article 20, then it means that you violated this, and you need to prove that. That would be, I think, the kind of the argument.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hello.
Because we can see the sufficient nexus has no wording.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I mean, it could be. Now, the main critic of judicial activism is the US, and in this case, it was in favor of the US, so they wouldn't use this as an example. But this, yeah, I mean, this could be argued that they are allowing countries to basically extraterritorially impose their own views on what countries are doing in their territory. Yeah.
And also I was wondering, like, in light of conservation of resources, it would have some overlap with the field of public international
Yeah.
and with the UNCLOS.
Yeah.
It also has some rules
Yeah.
on the conservation of natural
Yeah.
resources.
Yeah.
So I wonder, does the doctrine, why it's at first rejected the bill on the reason of it was like perhaps have some conflict with other rules.
No, but in this case, actually, in shrimp, they rely on UNCLOS. I will show you. They rely on UNCLOS to interpret natural resources. Yeah.
At the second class, you have explained that, right?
Yes, exactly. We're gonna quickly go through that again. Yeah. So they can rely on other rules to interpret. Yeah.
So other rules just for the subsidiary for
Yes.
one last question, perhaps. Like when the appellate court examined the criteria of sufficient nexus, as you have said, the turtle, they're migratory. So does that have any, I think it should be based on scientific.
Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. But that's why they didn't make, I feel like that's why they didn't make a statement. They simply said, in this case, we think that because they travel, but they made it like this is just in this case.
But does that not be a little bit arbitrary? Because
It
there's
is.
not evidence to prove that the turtle is migratory.
I mean, there is migratory, there is proof.
Yeah.
To what extent?
Yeah.
How many travel that was considered not to be relevant?
Okay, so
Yeah.
there is no evidence to
No. No. How many specimen are not? And they were actually in the language, they're like, we're not saying that every specimen, but some, at some point, it was very like that, the language.
Okay, but they have this conclusion of
Yeah, sufficient nexus, yeah.
okay, fine, I've got that. Thank you.
You see, the sum of the criticism might not be completely unwarranted.
Yeah.
Hello.
He says that if not go above the boundary,
Yeah.
is there any exception to that? General exceptions or whatever?
Yeah. So general exceptions apply to that. Yeah. Although tough. But the US is going to use national security, for sure.
So maybe the table when student pointed out that the boundary was lower than
Maybe it's, it could be. Maybe it's a violation. Yeah, it could be.
how many people can say that the last two measures were considered as legitimate?
I think ever. I think only in two cases. Yeah, that I know of. Yes. Yeah. But I checked. I think the last time I checked was a few years ago. But I don't think that is true. Yeah. But again, because sometimes they don't even those that are clearly falling under this, they don't even get challenged. So those that are challenged are usually there's a good chance that they are not. Yeah.
I have at my university Governor James Buckles.
Oh wow.
Yes, it was incredible.
Yes.
It was just a block course. He just came for like.
I think he was one of the judges in Shrimp. Yes.
And because I remembered, and then I was like, wait.
Yes, he was. I mean, yes.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Impressive. Wow. Very good. You're welcome. All right. Let's get back to business. I got a few excellent questions during the break, and there are a couple that I think everyone can benefit from. So I just wanted to super quickly pick up on them. The first one was actually just now, when it was whether, for example, if a country is now imposing very high tariffs, so beyond the bound rate, whether they can use Article 20. Yes, Article 20 can be used to justify any GATT violation. Now, the increasing tariffs that you're seeing now, in particular from the US, they will most likely try to justify them if there is a case under Article 21, which is national security. We will see national security, there's not a lot of jurisprudence, and it's very unclear to what extent, what is the limit of the power of the panel to determine, for example, what is essential security interest of the state. So it's an exception where countries have a little bit more power, let's say, to determine themselves whether that the exception applies or not. So from what I'd seen from the first USTR documents, that's where they were going. And then another question was about process and production methods. We talked about them last week. Remember, we talked a little bit and we said at the end that when the process and production method of a product is reflected in the physical properties, then usually that is taken into account in the likeness analysis under physical characteristics. But what about the carbon footprint in the production process? So those ppms that do not appear, and usually those are not taken into account in the likeness test. And one of the reasons why is because there is a preference for saying, okay, it violates, but then you try to justify under 20, because Article 20 provides a certain set of checks and balances, and it allows you to really filter and avoid having measures that are disguised protectionism. If you allowed ppms at the level of likeness, measures that didn't pass the chapeau because they were actually protectionist would then not violate Article 3. And so you would have, the risk is to have then measures that are disguised, protectionism, but, dressed as environmental or public health. So there is all that argument. So the first step, as we said, is to go through the paragraphs. And if you look at the paragraphs, you can see that they use different adjectives. Sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's relating to. So there are difference. Relating to, this is simply for the protection. Essential, they're very different. This is again another case where the US gasoline panel got it all wrong because it looked at B that says necessary and G that says relating to and interpreted them in the same way. And so the appellate body had to come in and say, no. These are different. You need to interpret them differently. Necessary cannot be interpreted, yes.
I had a different question. So
Is it super unrelated?
it's related to this article, but it's on public morals. I wanted to ask, like, does every country, can they each define what for them is public morals? Because like,
Yes.
it's very dependent on each.
Yes. Yeah, so we are not going to go through public morals today, but there have been a few cases on public morals. One of the latest is a case on seal products, with measure of the European Union limiting the import of seal products because of humane versus inhumane killing of seal products and how some indigenous communities traditionally kill seals. And one of the discussions on public morals was whose morals? And it's very much, one of the difficulties is that it is very much based on the specific culture, the specific state. It's a very difficult one, public morals. You rarely rely only on public morals. Usually you try to justify under a few other provisions. It's quite hard. But yes, there isn't a public morality. And the panel is not going to decide what public morals are. So they would study the market, they would study the situation in that specific country. Now, of course, necessary, for instance, you find it in 3 paragraphs. So there, the jurisprudence will help each other. So, for example, a lot of the steps forward in interpreting necessary has been in case law under letter D, which has then informed the case law of letter B. So when the term is the same, case law on letter D, necessary, has then helped the case law in letter B and A and so on and so forth, but it's important to keep them. And we will look at 2 letters. We will look at B and G, so you'll see the difference between necessary and relating to. I want to start with B. So, first of all, whenever you're looking at one letter, you need to remember that it's the paragraph plus the chapeau always, right? So you start with the paragraph and then you're going to have to look at the chapeau. And in general, when you have to look if a measure falls and is provisionally justified by Article 20b, you need to ask yourself 2 questions. Is the measure designed to protect human, animal, or plant life or health? And is it necessary to do so? I want to very quickly use this as an example, which is one of the cases that you have in the syllabus, which is Brazil retreaded tires. So Brazil imposed a bunch of different measures. They potentially violated a lot of different provisions of the GATT. One of them was an import ban on retreaded tires. Why? Because these kind of tires have a lower lifespan, so they become waste more quickly. Waste tires accumulate, they catch fire easily. The burning of these tires releases toxic fumes. They're also breeding grounds for mosquito-borne diseases, dengue fever, yellow fever. And when you transport waste tires to be disposed, you transport also these mosquitoes that bear diseases. So there is a public health argument. So this is the measure. And the measure, was found to violate, again, a lot of different things, including MFN. And in particular, the question was, is the measure designed to protect human, animal, or plant life or health? So you need to ask yourself, okay, so what is the objective? Is the objective the protection of human, animal, or plant life or health? And is the measure designed? So here the objective is to avoid the accumulation of waste tires. Is it about protecting human, animal, plant life, or health? Well, accumulation of waste tires, as you said, help spreading these diseases, these mosquito-borne diseases, with the transport, toxic fumes. So yes, there is a risk for human health, maybe animal health as well. So it is kind of about what letter B talks about. And is the measure designed? Well, if I want to reduce the sale and the import of this kind of tires that because of their reduced lifespan become waste tires more quickly, yes, we can say that it seems to be designed precisely to avoid the accumulation of waste tires, which then harm human health. So the design portion is usually kind of the easiest. The second harder question is it necessary? Is it necessary? The case law has evolved over the years. I'm not going to take you through the whole evolution. And actually, most of the evolution, we don't find it under letter B, we find it under letter D. But then it's been incorporated in the jurisprudence under letter B, in particular in Brazil tires, and even more so in EC asbestos, which is the other case that I want to tell you about. When you need to see whether the measure is necessary, you need to consider three things. You need to consider the importance of the value that you're protecting, to what extent the measure contributes to the achievement of that value, how trade restrictive it is. So those are the first three things you need to look at. If looking at these things, you think that, okay, it seems necessary, then you need to compare it with alternatives. Are there alternative measures that are less trade restrictive, but they could have allowed to achieve the same level of protection? So it's a complex examination. It's a holistic. You need to look at all these elements. You cannot just look at, oh my God, this is to protect health. Super important. Of course, it's necessary. You need to look at all these different elements. It's a holistic assessment. It's a weighing of and balancing of different factors. You need to go through all of this to then say, okay, it's necessary or not. I use the asbestos case because it's the simplest to show you this. We talked already about asbestos, right? So France bans the sale of asbestos fibers and products containing asbestos because it's carcinogenic, it's toxic. So how important is the value? Super important. Human life. Cancer is a life-threatening disease. This is the highest level possible of importance of a value. To what extent does the measure contribute to achieving the value? Well, if I ban the sale of these products, well, I'm going to contribute quite a lot to reducing the risk, because a product that is, knowingly highly carcinogenic will not longer be sold. So, I contribute. Of course, it doesn't mean that you don't need to show that you eliminate the risk. Cancer will exist, but you eliminate the contribution of these specific, materials to the risk. Then they analyzed the trade restrictiveness, and they said, yes, it's a very trade restrictive measure because you're banning the sale. You're not imposing a tax, for example, but you're saying no sale of these products. So it's a weighing and balancing. No? You need to put, in general, the more important the value and the more, the stronger the contribution, the less important is the trade restrictiveness. So in this case, it was so high, the value, and it was so strong, the nexus, that, okay, the trade restrictiveness, it's not so important. And in particular, are there alternatives? Now, of course, there are going to be less trade restrictive alternatives. That goes without saying. But do they allow France to reach the same level of protection? And here, this appellate body was very important because they said something which is very important, which is it's up to each country to choose the level of protection. How much do you want to protect your people? What is the level of risk that you're willing to accept? So a country cannot, no, another country, in this case was Canada, cannot go and tell France, oh, you're protecting too much. No, it's up to France. France here wanted zero risk. Zero risk of contamination from asbestos. Zero risk, not 5% risk, not 20%, zero. Canada cannot go and say, you're being too cautious. What Canada can do is come and say, look, I found an alternative that is less trade restrictive and that allows you to achieve the same level of protection that you chose. Now, Canada proposed controlled sale and controlled use of asbestos, which does not allow you to have zero risk. There is some level of risk. So in this case, the appellate body said, well, you proposed an alternative that is less trade restrictive, but it doesn't allow France to achieve the level of protection that they want for their people. So no. So the measure is necessary. It's a holistic assessment. Even if it's a very trade restrictive measure, when you look holistically at all the elements, you can find that it's necessary. Now, in the case of asbestos, what is interesting about the appellate body is that the appellate body didn't have to do this because the panel had found violation of 3.4 and then went to Article 20. But the appellate body reversed. There was no longer violation of 3.4. So it's irrelevant, but they still wanted to say what they thought about the interpretation of it, which is great. You know, this is, we academics very much appreciate when tribunals or judges say things they don't have to, but they really help us in understanding some of the main principles of, some important principles of international law have been said by tribunals that didn't have to, but they did. So that's quite nice for us. And this is the asbestos case. Is everything clear under Article B? So you need to look, is the measure designed? So what is the objective? Is the objective the protection of human, animal, or plant life or health? Is the measure designed? That's your first part. Second part, is the measure necessary? And then you need to consider together holistically how important is the value? How much does your measure contribute? How trade restrictive it is? You balance all these things and then you check the alternatives. Do the alternatives allow for less trade restrictions and do they allow to achieve the same level of protection? If the answer is no, then your measure is necessary. But you just satisfied B, you still have to go to Le Chapeau. That's just the first part. Let's move to G, it's the second one that I wanted to show you. Different, very, very different. Here it's not about being necessary, but it's relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. So you have three parts. First, is the measure about the conservation of exhaustible natural resources? Second, is it relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources? Third, is it made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption? You need to show these three things. And I'm going to use my favorite, shrimp, to show you. I already showed you actually this part. Remember during, I think, my first or second class, I showed you the evolutionary interpretation and how the appellate body relied on other rules of international law to interpret the text. And this is precisely what has happened here, because Article 20, it's the GATT, 1947. If you read the Travaux Préparatoires for Article 20, you see that when they talked about natural resources, they only talked about non-biological minerals, mostly. Because in the 1940s, nobody cared about turtles, about dolphins, about the environment. But, and this is why this is such a wonderful report, these words were crafted more than 50 years ago. But they must be read in the light of contemporary concerns of the community of nations about the protection and conservation of the environment. So yes, they're from the 1940s, but the world has changed. And remember, the preamble of the WTO agreement talks about sustainable development. This is your hook. This is your legal basis. This is why the appellate body could do what it did, which is, and I showed you already these paragraphs, it relied on UNCLOS, it relied on the CBD, on all these environmental treaties to say, today we cannot look at natural resources as only being non-biological. They also have to include biological. So sea turtles have to be considered natural resources because of all these things that have happened in international environmental law. And are they exhaustive? Because they have to be exhaustible natural resources. And here again, it looks at that convention that I showed you, CITES. There is a convention that tells us that all 7 species of sea turtles are at extremely high risk of extinction. So yes, they are exhaustible. So the first question, which again, in the tuna, there is I was teaching in another class. There is a case under the GATT in 1991 called tuna dolphin. So it's a lot about ban on import of tuna to protect dolphins, the US again, where the panel, at the time the GATT panel, didn't even look at this. They said, it's all about trade, it's all about economic concerns. Just 7 years later, the appellate body comes, bam, preamble of the WTO, sustainable development, this is how we need to interpret everything. So the first question is answered in the positive. Yes, it's about the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, sea turtles. Now, is it relating? Much easier, much lighter. You don't have to go through all that craziness, trade restrictiveness, holistic assessment. You basically need to show that there is an important and genuine contribution. And that there is a clear, genuine, true link with the objective. Now, in this case, the measure was like, okay, there is a ban. You cannot, export your shrimp unless you're certified. How do you obtain your certification? You need to prove that you use TED, that machine, or you need to prove that the portion of the ocean where you're catching your shrimp, there are no sea turtles, or there's no risk. So it's relating to conserving. It's clearly the exceptions, also how the measure is designed, it's really about the protection of the sea turtles. So that was also, it's not so hard to show relating to. Much higher threshold to show the necessity, because again, there should be a difference between the two. Very important, this one, because this one is also helpful to show that you're not trying just to block trade. Now, in this case, the US passed with flying colors because they also had their domestic laws that imposed to local fishermen to use TED. So that was across the board, domestic fishermen and foreigners. So it was, local production, consumption, local activities were also impacted in the same way. Let me give you an example instead of a case where this was not the case. It was a case that I briefly mentioned earlier, China raw materials. China imposed export restrictions, both quantitative restrictions and export duties on raw materials and rare minerals, but they kept extracting and they kept producing and consuming at the same rate. So their argument was that they wanted to conserve the natural resources, that extracting these minerals is very bad for the environment, which is true. And the idea was to preserve and conserve, but they were only limiting exports. Production, consumption was going on at the same rate. So it's really not, you cannot argue that it's about conserving. And if it's about conserving, you should have also reduced extraction and production. Everything clear on Article 20G? Because now we get to the chapeau. So many, many measures pass the test of the paragraphs. Not all, but many. Most do not pass the chapeau. The whole point of the chapeau is to look at the way in which the measure is implemented and make sure that the exception is not abused or misused. It's really try to avoid abuses and misuses. And you have here some very nice language in US gasoline and in US shrimp that tell you, I love these decisions in the 90s. They are better than textbooks. It's no longer the case. Now they're painful to read sometimes. But you see, it's not so much the measure itself. So it's not a judgment on the measure. We have already said that it's a great measure to protect animals or public health or whatever. That's done. The point is how it is applied. And it's important to avoid, what does it say? The chapeau is animated by principle. They may be invoked as a matter of a legal right, but they should not be so applied as to frustrate or defeat the legal obligations of the holder of the right under the substantive rules. So yes, you can use the exceptions, but you can abuse them. You cannot use them in a way that ends up nullifying the whole set of rights and obligations that you have in the GATT. And here you have it even better. It's super long. Where does it say? At some point it tells you here, for instance, voila, exercised by one member of its right to invoke an exception, if abused or misused, will erode or render not the substantive treaty rights. So you can't allow abuses or misuse, and the chapeau is there to kind of try to avoid that. And again, I will show you now an example. And it goes on and it tells you that basically this is an expression of good faith. So we have established that you're trying to pursue a legitimate policy objective, but you cannot do it in a way that is unjustifiably discriminatory, or it's a disguised restriction, disguised protectionism, basically. So it looks like an environmental measure, but really you're protecting your industry. It tries to filter between these two types. It's about the application, how the measure is applied, and it cannot be applied in a way that constitutes a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or disguised restriction on international trade. Now, the yellow one is the most interesting. Disguised restriction, usually it's a similar analysis of the previous one, and it's found to be in violation of this, and so they barely get to this. So a lot of the interesting case law, we have it on this. And I'm gonna give you the example again of US shrimp. I'm sorry to continue and press on this, but this is just a very easy example to give. The US proved that the measure was provisionally justified under 20G, but it failed the chapeau. They did two things that showed that the measure was arbitrarily and unjustifiably discriminatory in the way in which it was applied. Two things. The first thing, the measure was very rigid. You had to use TED between countries where the same conditions prevail. Not all countries have the same capability to adopt exactly the same mechanism that you have come up with. They might have their own systems, which may be comparable in effectiveness. But they wanted TED. So this rigidity, this flexibility, made it arbitrarily and unjustifiably discriminatory. If you really care about conserving natural resources, the sea turtles, if somebody can show that they're doing something else that is still helpful, well, that should count. But it didn't. First thing. Second thing, they had negotiated some agreements on the protection of sea turtles with some Latin American countries, but they did not negotiate with those countries. So they had selected some countries with which to negotiate different ways to conserve natural resources, but not with India, Pakistan, Thailand, and Malaysia. Now, this is a principle that is not just of trade law, but it's of environmental law as well, that before acting unilaterally, you cooperate. That's preferred. So they could have gone to these 4 countries and say, what up? What can we do? Let's figure out a way to deal with this. And instead, they didn't talk to them, they just imposed the ban. So these 2 features, so this is you see why we need Article 20? The measure was not a bad measure, but it was implemented in a way that was overly restricting. So the US lost. But it didn't lose because of lack of sensitivity to environmental concerns. And I'm going to show you, we're late again, but it's okay. I want to spend time on this. I want to show you 2 paragraphs that are probably some of my favorite paragraphs in, well, at least in trade law. From this, I mean, you will see, this is how they are basically finding that these are discriminatory. You will find it in the slides. But I want to show you these 2 paragraphs. It was so important for the appellate body to make this point. We wish to underscore what we have not decided. We have not decided that the protection and preservation of the environment is of no significance. Clearly it is. We have not decided that the sovereign nations that are members of the WTO cannot adopt effective measures to protect endangered species. Clearly they can and should. And we have not decided that sovereign states should not act together within the WTO or outside to protect the environment. Clearly they should and do. So it's not because we don't care about the environment, but what we have decided is simply this. The measure serves an environmental objectives, it's legitimate, but it's applied in a way. So the problem is with the way in which it's applied, which is implemented. This is a powerful, important, I mean, now again, the appellate body is gone, so it's lost, but this goes to show that you design and you implement your measure well, you will be fine. After that other case, the tuna dolphin case, there was a lot of panic in the environmental community. Oh my God, we cannot have trade measures because if you have a trade measure to protect the environment, it's going to be destroyed by the GATT and the WTO. There was this crazy panic, and the appellate body is trying to keep people calm. No. You just design and implement your measure well. Don't disguise protectionism. Don't play games. We'll find it. And you can protect the environment. You should. This one, again, I'm not going to spend time because if you look at, in some of the cases there is a little bit on this, but it's really a repetition on arbitrary and unjustifiable because usually it's immediately found to be arbitrarily and unjustifiably discriminatory, and so they barely get to this part. Is everything clear regarding Article 20? Yeah? And again, what I think is important, all the analysis on, if I focused, and even the material is on these 2 letters, B and G. If any of you, for any reason, you're interested and you want to look at other cases, for example, then again, when it says necessary, they all complement each other. So you can use the same, you're looking at letter D or letter A, you can apply the same reasoning. We have 5 minutes. Let me try to say a few things on national security. And then, well, I'm doing better, but still not as I would want to. Very quickly. So this is a provision, an exception that was basically silent for 70 years. Nobody seemed to understand why it was even there. And then, in the last 10 years, it's been used a lot. It's been used a lot, and we don't have a lot of case law. So for Article 20, we have such a rich jurisprudence that we have a really good understanding of how to interpret. For Article 21, not so much. In particular, because there have been many countries that have argued that it's self-judging. It's a little bit like the public morals point. It's for the country to determine whether it's a national security, whether there is the protection of an essential security interest. You cannot tell me what is my essential security interest. This is a matter for me to say. The panel cannot judge on this. So there have been a lot of arguments in this sense. And so a lot of the discussions have been, okay, where can the panel intervene, and when instead we need to kind of defer to the states to actually decide, what is national security or essential security interest, and so on and so forth. But somebody was asking me earlier about the tariffs now, for example, and again, a lot of tariffs will be justified under this article. I wrote a piece this summer with a colleague, Professor Makam Beng. Some of you might have had very quick blog post on a specific tariff that at some point, I don't even know if it's in place, because Trump has been imposing and it's just impossible to keep track of the back and forth. But at some point in the summer, he imposed a very high tariff on India, because India was still buying oil and gas from Russia. So it was a very indirect way to punish Russia. And when they imposed this tariff, immediately, some writings from the mission were saying, we would justify it under Article 21. And so we started kind of thinking, okay, can you justify this tariff? So a lot of these tariffs would be justified under this provision. Most of the jurisprudence, which again is very small, in the syllabus you have probably the main or one of the main decisions, has to do with this. So a measure that violates the GATT that is adopted to prevent, to protect the essential security interests of the country, either because of fissionable materials, so those are materials that you can, basically the fuel you can use in a nuclear reactor, plutonium, uranium, or related to the traffic in arms, and in particular this one, very popular. Now it's going to be very popular. Taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations. And this is the case, have a look at the material on the syllabus. This is the case where this was for the first time interpreted and applied. It was this letter B3. Letter B3. It was a case brought by Ukraine against Russia because Russia had restricted transit of goods, of Ukrainian goods. And it was found to be in violation of the protocol, the accession protocol of Russia, because there are provisions on transit that we don't have in the GATT, and they were trying to justify it under Article 21B. And in general, you need to show two things. First, that the measure has been taken in time of war or other emergency in international relations, and that it's necessary for the protection of the essential security interests. The one thing that I want you to remember here is that Russia was arguing that it's up to Russia to decide all of this because it's part of the state. And an important distinction that